From Virginia Tech University, Dr. Cayce Myers joins us once again on the program. He will stop in from time to time to give us more insight into a number of different topics. Today, we are discussing redistricting and the process of our judicial system in how that redistricting will move forward. First of all, Dr. Myers, thanks for being here. I hope the week's going all right for you.
Yes, thank you for having me.
No doubt. And the latest news that we got, of course, is the appeal to the United States Supreme Court by Virginia Democrats to allow this new map to go forward. I want to go backwards before we get to where we stand right now. When you saw the Virginia Supreme Court ruling 4-3 that those maps would be invalidated due to procedural issues, what was your sort of initial reaction to the state Supreme Court ruling a couple weeks ago?
Well, I wasn't surprised that it was a split decision. I was looking for that. We had heard in the oral argument a real discussion around what does an election mean? What does it mean to be election day versus the process of elections themselves, where you have early voting? And I wasn't surprised to see that the court really focused on that, because that seemed to be the major issues that they were grappling with in the oral argument. Now, how that plays out in a case, kind of is dependent upon how the majority votes and how they write the decision. So you can't read too much into the kind of the oral argument. But again, I wasn't surprised to see that was really the kind of the main talking point. I was interested to see in the first part of the case, though, a real discussion around what does it mean to vote, and what does it mean in terms of elections historically in Virginia. Going back to the colonial times, they've spent a huge time talking about how, in the time of, going all the way back to, the 18th century, how elections were conducted, what does it mean to vote, and then also a real criticism of gerrymandering as a concept. So all of that, an interesting opinion. I think that one that the Republicans are very happy about, and obviously the Democrats are not, and there's national implications.
Of course, and when we talk about that question of what does it mean to vote, we know that sticking point is that there appears to be a precedent set now that once early voting has started, the election has started. Beyond that, is there anything else that you'll take from this decision regarding that sort of core question? What does it mean to vote? What does it mean to be in an election?
Well, one of the things in an election, and one of the questions is that, when does an election occur? And this is not something that's just unique to Virginia. There's other questions around this as well, where you have people who are voting by mail, and then their vote that is postmarked by the date of the election comes in after the election. Does that vote count? And that's a case going on right now in Mississippi, a question around that particular concept of, when does the vote count? When is an election? Again, this is very important point, particularly from a procedural standpoint, because what was going on in this referendum is, this process where there has to be a vote passed in the delegates, then an intervening election, and then it passed again, and then the referendum is sent out. And the core kind of philosophy behind that was that there was this opportunity provided through both the election, the intervening election, and through the referendum itself, for there to be kind of like two times where the voters can weigh in. And so what ended up happening here is the court said, well, they weren't able to weigh in that intervening election because early voting had already begun. There had been ballots cast, and they give us a figure, and I think it's over 1 million ballots were cast. And so there's not that ability to kind of really have that two-step process. So again, this is something that I think is significant. I don't think it spells the end of referendum and redistricting in Virginia. I don't think that it also is the end of this conversation writ large. Certainly, a legislature could come back and using this precedent, if it stays as good law, use a more kind of deliberative process and still get a referendum presented to the public again. So that's something that's always a possibility.
You speak of this not being the end. We now have that next step, which is the appeal to the United States Supreme Court. We know that the makeup of the United States Supreme Court leans Republican in this modern iteration. Is there any reason to expect a different result than we got from the Virginia Supreme Court here?
Well, I think that's a question that a lot of people are asking, and I don't know that it's really the best way to view it is through the lens of whether this is going to be a Republican court or a Democratic court. I think it's through the lens of, is there a federal question here? The state says that it is, and it's largely around, the definitions of what does it mean to be be elected or have an election versus election day. Typically, Supreme Court of the United States does not intervene in a state Supreme Court's interpretation of a state constitution. That's considered a state matter outside really the realm of what the Supreme Court of the United States is going to take up. Could they get involved? Perhaps. A lot of people will say that it looks unlikely, not necessarily because of the Republican-Democrat split or the conservative-liberal split, but because of just that question of state versus federal and what is the jurisdiction and what is their under their purview that they would take up as a case, and they seem to be reluctant to do that.
And so what should we be looking for as Virginians? What's the next thing that we need to take note of in order to see this process moving forward from the Supreme Court? There's a chance they won't rule on this at all, it sounds like is what you're saying, that they will say this is not our case to rule on. It's been ruled on by the states, and that's as far as it needs to go. Is that correct?
But potentially, yes. I mean, they have this right now, this week, they have a question around whether or not they're going to, hear this case. And again, there's this sense that, is this something that's going to be within the sort of the realm of what they usually evaluate? It could be that they just, they allow the Supreme Court of Virginia's decision to stand. But what I would say also is that there's a lot of chatter, kind of political chatter, around what does this mean? How are Democrats going to respond? And we've seen some reports of some ideas like, Virginia's Supreme Court retirement ages and things like that being changed. Again, that's unsubstantiated in a way because that seems to be kind of difficult to understand how that would even play out in a timely way. That's the other issue that we have here in these cases is that you have an election coming up, you have a filing deadlines that are coming up, you have primaries that are coming up. And so really the outcome is kind of compressed by this timeline. And again, this is all against a national backdrop. And I think it's important for people to understand these other states' redistrictings are a different process. One is a different state process, but some of these southern states' redistrictings are coming out of a situation where it's a kind of a different kind of legal cause, which is the United States Supreme Court had a case where they have kind of reinterpreted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and now we're seeing states like Alabama and maybe Florida and some other states redrawing their congressional maps to be more pro-Republican. So what is the net result going to be in 2026?
And if I remember correctly, those two rulings, the Virginia Supreme Court ruling nullifying this new map favoring Democrats and the United States Supreme Court ruling that sort of severely weakened the Voting Rights Act, which creates a situation that is likely advantageous for Republicans, especially in those southern states. I mean, you look at these two rulings back to back. How damaging is this for Democrats' chances in the midterms overall?
Well, I think it kind of remains to be seen how fast all this can happen, right? Because we're up against these primary deadlines, we're up against these filing deadlines, and one of the issues is that can these redistricted states, get it together enough to have an election with these new boundaries? And right now, what it appears is that this is a net disadvantage for Democrats. Certainly in Virginia, it is, and in the southern states that are redrawing a kind of a more pro-Republican map. Again, what does the final math look like? I don't know. There are some discussions amongst Democrats that there could be other states redrawn. There's a discussion going on right now, like could Maryland be redrawn? Could something in Colorado be redrawn? But again, that's a process, and that's very distinct state by state. And so the Supreme Court of Virginia case is really about the Virginia process. This this voting rights case is a totally separate issue that has kind of triggered this chain reaction in some southeastern states saying, okay, we're going to now redraw Democratic districts to be Republican districts or eliminate Democratic districts altogether. And that's going to give a net advantage. What that math looks like at the end of the day really depends on how quickly the states work and what the timeline is. It could be a net result where there's no clear advantage for either side, or it could be a Republican advantage. It just remains to be seen. And we may not see the final impact of that until 2028.
Yeah, and it all is against, of course, a backdrop of approval ratings for President Trump and his economy, along with an incumbent president facing a midterm that typically in the past traditionally will see a swing. So many factors at play here. You know, you mentioned how there's now this debate here in Virginia and a Virginia Supreme Court decision as to when an election begins. And it's a debate that will shape so much of how the state voting districts look. And then over in Alabama, you have a situation where there's talk of completely nullifying the results of a primary as they scramble to redraw those districts. I know every state is different and every state has a different constitution, but when I look at the contrast of those two things, how Virginia has sort of this airtight system where even with sort of a slight legal wiggle room, it ends up being nullified, whereas in Alabama there's talk of not, completely and totally eradicating a primary result. How can there be such drastically different approaches among states to something that every state uniformly has in congressional voting?
Yeah, so that has to do with the state constitution, the politics of the state, also the way that those constitutions were drawn. If you go back to the Virginia Constitution and the way that it was created and this process was talked about, and this is going back in the 70s, I believe, where they're talking about this process. They wanted this to be a very deliberative process where there were two opportunities for voters to really provide a kind of almost like two referendums in a way. There's a referendum on who we're going to put in the legislature, and then there's a referendum on the referendum itself, right? And so in other states, it works differently. Again, Virginia had a bipartisan commission that were drawing congressional maps. Other states don't necessarily have that. And I think that's really just the politics of the state, and the voters of the state have that as their kind of, as an extension of what their philosophy is, an extension of what their expectations are. Now, you're right in your discussion around President Trump and the referendum on the president in a midterm. Typically, that goes against the incumbent president's party, and that has been the case all but in a handful of exceptions. I believe President George W. Bush in 2002 had gains. I think Bill Clinton had gains in 1998, and I think you had to go all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt to find where our incumbent president had gains in the Congress during a midterm election. Typically, they lose. But again, it also depends upon how districts are drawn. You could have unpopularity. You could have low, satisfaction amongst the voters. But if you're in a district that is very red or very blue, you could field a very good candidate of the opposite party, but they're still going to lose because just the makeup of that district is such it is just really a one-party district. And that's what I think is emerging as a trend here in the United States.
And it speaks to just how many factors are at play here as we approach the midterms: legislative, judicial, executive, and then, of course, the will of the electorate. So there is a lot going on. We always appreciate you coming on to break it down. Is there anything else you want to draw attention to that maybe I didn't ask about?
Well, I think we talked about it, but again, this timeline is really, really close. And I think what we're going to see is that this is a topic of discussion right now with the Supreme Court of Virginia and the United States Supreme Court. But this is not the end. I think we'll talk about this in 27, and I think we're going to talk about it in 28. And this may be a new political norm on redistricting as a strategy. Moreover, if you have more time, I think more states may engage in this that haven't engaged in it. And it just is a sign of the hyperpolarization that we're living in right now.
Okay, so potential changes to come. And then you said something there that obviously is, boy, I mean, to think that this is going to become a regular political strategy of simply redrawing lines to gain seats. It'll be interesting to see where things go from here, certainly. And I'm sure we'll talk to Dr. Cayce Myers again from Virginia Tech University as we explore everything to come. But we appreciate you joining us today, Dr. Myers.
Thank you.